Ladies and gentlemen, the big news now coming in from the BRICS Summit in Kazan. As far as Prime Minister Modi is concerned, at least 6 bilaterals are to take place. In fact, we are given to understand that Prime Minister Modi will be meeting Chinese President Xi Jinping. The bilateral, which is scheduled to sometime tomorrow, the timing is yet to be confirmed by the Ministry of External Affairs. But remember, this comes almost after 5 years. The meeting was officially announced by the Foreign Secretary a short while back in Kazan by Vikram Misri. And in the press briefing, this is what he had to say. Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping's meeting highlights the importance of this engagement between the leaders of two neighboring nations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this becomes extremely important, keeping in mind that as far as the standoff is concerned, both the countries, after multiple disengagement rounds that have taken place, have agreed to the 2020 position, which effectively means that they have gone back to the status quo ante. This is exactly what India's position has been as far as the line of actual control patrolling is concerned. Just to put this into perspective, it's also what we saw back in 2018, just ahead of the BRICS Summit, where the disengagement, particularly in Depsang and Depchong, are concerned. Now, remember, this is that big move that has been made, and perhaps laying the ground for both the leaders to meet tomorrow. First, take a look at this report as to what's really expected in the bilateral.
The optics couldn't have been better. With 5 new members and 32 other nations wanting to join BRICS, Russia's apparent geopolitical isolation is all but over. Since the start of the Ukraine war in 2022, Russia has faced Western ire, President Putin even getting arrest warrants.
Erstens, die Ukraine kann sich auf uns verlassen. Zweitens ist es eine klare Botschaft an Putin. Ein Spiel auf Zeit wird nicht funktionieren. Wir werden in unserer Unterstützung für die Ukraine nicht nachlassen.
Putin has the gall to say he's denazifying Ukraine. It's a lie. It's just cynical. He knows that. And it's also obscene. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
Despite all this criticism, diplomatic rush hour in Kazan, venue of the 16th BRICS Leaders Summit, shows how strongly multipolar the world has become, with Russia still holding forth. As possibly the only truly non-aligned nation which is heard on both the sides, this is also the moment for India and Prime Minister Modi under the sun to be showcasing our position as a major geopolitical pole. Be it the key pre-opening bilateral with President Putin, or the acknowledgement from Putin himself to Giorgia Meloni of Italy that Prime Minister Modi can play a crucial role in peace in Europe. Both the global north and the global south indeed seem to be turning to India. However, the US was quick to put out its veiled stance on the BRICS Summit 2024, playing down the significance. Even as the West watches from the fence, India not only held a bilateral with Iran, but has also confirmed that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi will meet on the sidelines of the BRICS Summit. But with all the action at the BRICS Summit in Kazan, has the West now realized that eliminating Russia from the global stage remains nearly impossible in today's global order.
Well, in fact, lots lined up as far as this BRICS is concerned, particularly with over 36 nations participating in the summit itself. And perhaps this is the biggest representation that we are really looking at the global south. But before we get into the details of what's really expected tomorrow, the big takeaway also on the sidelines of BRICS, you already have multiple bilaterals that are lined up, beginning with China. Of course, a short while back, we have seen the bilateral that the Prime Minister has had with President Putin and the big takeaways. Also, we'll take you through all the details with that. I'm also joined by my colleague Krutharth. We'll break it down for all our viewers who are tuning in right now. But before that, the announcement that was made by the Ministry of External Affairs just a short while back in Kazan about Prime Minister's meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Listen in.
I can confirm that there will be a bilateral meeting held between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping tomorrow, 23rd of October, on the sidelines of the BRICS Summit. The exact time and other logistics are being worked out, but the meeting will take place tomorrow. I can confirm that there will be a bilateral meeting held between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping tomorrow, 23rd of October, on the sidelines of the BRICS Summit. The exact time and other logistics are being worked out, but the meeting will take place tomorrow.
First, in fact, let's just take our viewers through the bilateral that has been over a short while back with President Putin and Prime Minister Modi. And the big takeaways, particularly with regards to the Prime Minister's emphasis on what is it expected as far as Russia-Ukraine war is concerned. And the big takeaway essentially about India's participation in it. We'll also play out those visuals that came in a short while back. Prime Minister meeting President Putin. Let's play those visuals that came in just a short while back, as my colleague Krutharth will also take you through the details of the bilateral that took place. First, Krutharth, this is happening in a span of less than 3 months. In fact, the outreach that India has had with Russia after Prime Minister's visit to Ukraine. You've had the National Security Advisor landing in Russia, briefing the Russians about the developments that have taken place. The big takeaway from today's bilateral with President Putin.
Well, the key words that Prime Minister Modi used to describe the Russia relationship are the ones that are the major headline-seeking words. And these are a specially privileged and a dynamically developing partnership. And that is even more important when the Prime Minister of India, who is meeting President Putin in a span of just 3 months for the second time, saying those words. Because essentially Prime Minister Modi was for the longest of time looked at as a potential mediator. And at a time when the entire West is looking at the BRICS Summit with a lot of intrigue as how the Russian isolation plan is sort of not falling into place as they would have expected, with Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a lot of countries together coming and holding a successful multi-forum, multilateral committee meeting that is representative of almost 3 billion people from around the world. So indeed, when the BRICS Summit will speak about global peace, the people in the West will be surely hearing with a keen ear to the ground as to what exactly will be the closed-door conversations that happen in Kazan conference tomorrow. But especially the bilateral relationship as far as India and Russia is concerned, it is a relationship that is difficult for one to understand without translation, is what President Putin had to say about the India and Russia partnership, clearly hinting at the West on the fact that they completely always try to bring in a factor where India and Russia relationship is looked at from a very Western prism, and how India is always looked at as if it's trying to put up a balancing act. However, the relationship between India and Russia has been one of privilege and has been consistent since 1950. As very recently, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar was also quoted by saying that the India and Russia partnership is one that has always remained consistent since its independence and one that has always been favorable towards India, Shawan.
Well, in fact, also the big takeaway coming in with the announcement that was made by Foreign Secretary a short while back about the bilateral that's going to take place with Chinese President Xi Jinping. In fact, this happens to be the first bilateral after the 2020 Galwan clash that took place. Interestingly, back in 2018, also just ahead of the BRICS Summit, remember the disengagement plan that both the countries came to some sort of a conclusion. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, the big news essentially coming in with regards to, one, both the countries have now decided to go back to its own position of 2020, essentially the patrolling that existed back in 2020 before the standoff actually began. So that's the big news really coming in. We'll put out the big takeaways in a short while from now, and also the takeaways from the bilateral that has taken place a short while back. A total of 6 bilaterals that are going to take place tomorrow. In fact, with the Iranian president also that is scheduled. In fact, that's also another key area, because perhaps the West here, Krutarth, would be looking at this very closely. And the formation of BRICS, the expansion of BRICS in itself, is something that the West appears to be extremely uncomfortable with. But first, what's really expected on the agenda, the negotiating table, as far as the bilateral with China is concerned?
What is very interesting is that this bilateral meeting once again comes on the back of the BRICS Summit. The last time Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping of China were seen interacting was on the sidelines of the BRICS Summit during the Bali Summit that happened in the year 2022. So if there was any multilateral forum that was going to succeed to bring these two leaders back to the talking table, well, it's quite poetic that it in the end became the BRICS Summit. Now, the BRICS Summit is essentially going to play a very important role, because we also understand that Russia has been a key player in the negotiations between India and China. At least that can be inferred from by the fact that the last high-level meet between India and Russia that took place was also in St. Petersburg between NSA Ajit Doval and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Well, what would be on the agenda tomorrow? Certainly, it would be the finalization of the petroleum agreement signed between India and China. At the same time, India and China will also be looking at forward talks for normalization of ties, because remember, India and China is not just a border standoff dispute. China remains one of India's largest trading partners, and the strategic partnership between the two big powerhouses of Asia and arguably for the rest of the world have a lot of discussions to do in terms of normalization of ties, be it from resuming air flights between India and China, or it be Chinese direct investment in Indian companies. There's a host of issues that would be on the top of the agenda. However, more or so, it is inferred upon that Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping's first meeting since 2020 standoff in Galwan will be one of an ice-breaking session, and that will set the tone and the momentum in the India-China ties that we expect to see in the next 5 years of the Modi government and for the subsequent term of President Xi Jinping of China. Shawan.
Well, in fact, as far as BRICS is concerned, remember, as far as China is concerned, their national interest is something that one cannot really ignore, keeping in mind that their connection with the Iranians too. The very fact that you have most of the oil exports really taking place with Iran. So that's another area that one would be closely looking at right now. We'll try and see if we have Arth, who's also joining us on this broadcast. Arth, a short while back with Prime Minister meeting the Iranian president, that's another big message being sent across, where the Prime Minister essentially reaching out to all the leaders about finding a peaceful solution to the conflict in West Asia. That perhaps is the driving force right now in most of the talks that the Prime Minister has had.
Absolutely, Shawan. As we saw that this was the first meeting between the two leaders since the president of Iran took over in the month of July. After that, India, and also notably India and Iran, as we all know, we share long-standing civilizational ties. The Chabahar port also remains a key agenda item on the whole range of items that India and Iran are all set to work upon together. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar visited Iran in January 2024, which was his first visit to Iran since the country joined the grouping in 2023. And now, after the conflict in West Asia, a rampant escalation of the conflict in West Asia, this sure will be a key integral matter in the discussion which was held between the Iranian president and the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi.
Well, in fact, I'll request both of you to stay on with us as we quickly take our viewers through the big takeaways of day one of the BRICS Summit. In fact, around 2 o'clock this afternoon is when Prime Minister landed in Kazan. And remember, thereafter, the big bilateral certainly taking place with President Putin. This was in the evening. We'll take you through that statement that was made. The focus also on the BRIC declaration, which essentially is the roadmap ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, what perhaps makes this BRICS way different than what we have seen in the past is, one, the expansion of BRICS itself. China has also played a pivotal role in ensuring that there is an expansion, keeping in mind their own interest here. But as far as India is concerned, remember that positioning that India had essentially taken back during the G20 summit itself and bringing in the Global South. The representation of Global South is something that is the key focus. Also, remember the big alternative that Russia has been talking about is the BRICS payment. How do you really tackle the dollar dominance? And that is exactly what the discussion that took place today between the NDB and the Russians. How exactly would you really challenge that? Krutat, the big takeaway here is about the BRICS payment too, an alternative to dollar. And that in itself, as Russia has been pointing out, is the end of the dollar dominance.
And one of the most intriguing factoids about the BRICS is that BRICS nations together control around 44% of the global crude oil production. Now that is a massive number considering that it is not an exclusively OPEC plus type of a grouping. Now, when you think of a grouping at a multilateral level, which controls nearly 50% of the global crude oil productions, all eyes will be surely on an alternative BRICS currency, which has been in the works or at least at a talking stage for many BRICS summit now. Now, this is the 16th edition of BRICS, and it seems like the BRICS nations at least are feeling that they are matured enough as an alliance in the last 16 years that they can perhaps create an alternative currency that can run in the petrol trade, in the global oil trade. This will have obviously massive repercussions for the United States, which also saw a lot of federal rate cuts quite recently. However, it's not just about the immediate economic impact, but also the long-term implications. However, de-dollarization when it comes to crude oil manufacturing and sales is not something that can be taken lightly, and it's very difficult to execute. However, if there is any other multilateral forum that can, let's say, dare to have such an ambitious plan, then perhaps it would be the BRICS grouping.
Well, in fact, the statement that was made by the Russians after the meeting that took place with the newly appointed NDB chairman is something that many would be looking forward to, and perhaps that lays the roadmap for the BRIC nations. In fact, we'll play out the statement that was made in a short while from now, but a quick comment from my colleague Arth, who is also joining us on this broadcast. Arth, just to focus about tomorrow's agenda, do we have more details with regards to the other bilaterals that are lined up? We were told that about 6 bilaterals are going to take place during Prime Minister's 2-day visit to Russia.
Prime Minister Modi, right before the key opening of the BRICS Summit, held bilateral talks with President Putin of Russian Federation, which is also being termed as the big bilateral of the summit. And then we saw how President Xi Jinping held bilaterals, is supposed to hold a bilateral talk with Prime Minister Modi tomorrow, and how Prime Minister Modi will also be holding key bilaterals with key ministers from various BRICS states. And this comes right after India-China bilateral that is all set to be held tomorrow, which was just now confirmed by the Ministry of External Affairs, is going to be one important bilateral, Shravan, because remember, since 2020, after 2020, many analysts had believed that India-China relations have reached an implacable decline. But this bilateral sure brings out a very new phase in the whole bilateral dynamic between India and China. Back to the studio, Shravan.
Well, thank you very much, Arth and Krutat, for getting us the latest. In fact, viewers, leaving you with that statement that was made by the Prime Minister after the bilateral, particularly laying the roadmap of what's really expected in the second day of the summit.
एक्सेलेंसी, मैं आपकी मित्रता, गर्मजोशी भरे स्वागत और आतिथ्य सत्कार के लिए हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करता हूं। मेरे लिए खुशी की बात है कि ब्रिक्स समिट के लिए कजान जैसे खूबसूरत शहर में आने का अवसर मिला है। इस शहर के साथ भारत के गहरे और ऐतिहासिक संबंध रहे हैं। कजान में भारत के नए कॉन्सुलेट के खुलने से ये संबंध और मजबूत होंगे। एक्सेलेंसी, पिछले 3 महीनों में मेरा 2 बार रूस आना हमारे करीबी समन्वय और गहरी मित्रता को दर्शाता है। जुलाई में मॉस्को में हुई हमारी एनुअल समिट से हर क्षेत्र में हमारे सहयोग को बल मिला है। एक्सेलेंसी, पिछले 1 वर्ष में ब्रिक्स की सफल अध्यक्षता के लिए मैं आपको बधाई देता हूं। 15 वर्षों में ब्रिक्स ने अपनी एक विशेष पहचान बनाई है और अब विश्व के अनेक देश इससे जुड़ना चाहते हैं। कल मैं ब्रिक्स समिट में भाग लेने के लिए उत्सुक हूँ। एक्सेलेंसी, रूस और यूक्रेन के बीच चल रहे संघर्ष के विषय पर हम लगातार संपर्क में रहे हैं। जैसा मैंने पहले भी कहा है, हमारा मानना है कि समस्याओं का समाधान शांतिपूर्ण तरीके से ही होना चाहिए। शांति और स्थिरता की जल्द से जल्द बहाली का हम पूरी तरह समर्थन करते हैं। हमारे सभी प्रयास मानवता को प्रमुखता देते हैं। आने वाले समय में भी भारत हर संभव सहयोग देने के लिए तैयार है। एक्सेलेंसी, आज इन सभी विषयों पर विचार साझा करने का एक और महत्वपूर्ण अवसर है। एक बार फिर बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।